Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. We had, I think, a decent success this week at the National Press Club on Tuesday evening, the commemoration of the arrival of the Russian Baltic Fleet in New York Harbor 150 years ago to the day. We were right on the anniversary. This program was taped by C-SPAN, and we're hoping that C-SPAN 3, the American History Channel, will broadcast it within the usual 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks. As far as I know, this was the only commemoration of that historical event. And if you want to go and see how it was viewed at the time, you can go back to Harper's Weekly, the principal news publication and news magazine of that era, century and a half ago, and you'll see that at least two of the two editions had that on the cover, that the cover story was the Russian fleet and the emerging Entente, or indeed alliance. And I want to, without further ado, thank a couple of benefactors who helped make this possible, because it's not free, and it does take some resources. And that would be, my thanks go out to Chris Loist and to Susan Anderson. Chris Loist and Susan Anderson, thank you for helping make this possible, along, of course, with other contributors. Now, we've got to rush in medias res. The House Republicans, fanatics, anarchists, extremists, wacko birds, chuckleheads, I don't know, individuals who are sincerely bewildered by the modern world, I sometimes think. They are attempting to shut down the United States government. That's not the news, but they're using the debt ceiling in mid-October, but more immediately they're looking at the fact that the current spending authority of the federal government runs out at midnight Monday, September 30th. At midnight, spending authority ends. Tuesday, October 1st, new fiscal year, and normally new legislation would be required. Now, I want to point to the solution even before we go further with it. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, and the so-called Deficiency Act about you can't spend money unless it's been appropriated, that's served us well for a long time. But I would like to focus on something bubbling up from those splendid laboratories of democracy, which are the states, or in this case, not even states, but the District of Columbia, which really ought to be a state and has the appurtenances of a state. It acts like a state. It's just formally not a state. Mayor Vincent C. Gray, on Wednesday, designated the entirety of the district government as essential to the protection of public safety, health, and property. And this means, as he told the Office of Management and Budget of the federal government, that all of those activities will continue to be performed during a lapse in appropriation. The entire calculus here is that some functions of government are labeled as essential and others as non-essential. But, of course, if they're non-essential, why are they being funded? I think we're facing one of those moments of crisis. We can go back and compare it to what Lincoln faced in 1861 to 1865, the crisis of secessionism, coming on the heels of nullification and interposition, all motivated by the slave power conspiracy. And then from 1939 to 1945, of course, the World War II emergency. And these have inevitably resulted in the growth of executive power. And it seems to me that we ought to look at what Mayor Gray of the district is doing. In his case, he says this money that he wants to spend belongs to the District of Columbia. Those are local tax dollars. And if Congress, because of this dysfunctional group of chuckleheads and wacko birds, fascists, reactionaries, obscurantists, wreckers, saboteurs, exponents of chaos, well, if they can't get their act together to do some funding and provide for the normal functioning of government, well, then it's probably time to override their shenanigans. And one included feature of this would be to take a leaf now from the book of Mayor Gray of the District of Columbia. You can declare the entire federal government to be essential, and it will simply be funded at existing levels. In other words, a continuing resolution. The funding of all federal government activities at the current rate will be provided. And lest anybody object, they'd say, well, that's a form of emergency rule, isn't it? Isn't that ruling by decree? Well, indeed, the federal government right now is functioning under emergencies. We have several emergencies in force, many of them declared by the reactionary warmonger Republicans themselves, going back to Bush. We have the 9/11 emergency. Bush declared a state of emergency. We have the Afghanistan emergency. That's, I guess, another layer of emergency when that war started. We have the Iraq emergency. We have an emergency declared after the stock market derivative panic of 2008, the banking panic. We've got, by my count, at least 4 emergencies. Undoubtedly, we have more. I'm sure people can look this up and find the number of emergencies. Under those emergencies, it is relatively easy to find the legal authority necessary to maintain the essential functions of government. We're dealing here with inherent powers. We've got inherent powers, we've got implied powers, and we've got the enumerated powers. The enumerated powers are the least of them. And when we look at the end of the enumerated powers, we find the elastic clause, all laws necessary and proper to promote the goals that are enumerated in the Constitution, and the general goals, things like general welfare, common defense. Basically, you'd look at the preamble, and you'd say, well, under the preamble, in the light of these emergencies, we've got to maintain the functioning of the federal government, because otherwise you could face a permanent shutdown. These fanatics, these lunatics, when will they cease and desist? They do not cease and desist. They come back fighting even harder. Somebody was saying on the blab shows, well, why don't these Republicans realize that Obamacare has been voted on and it's the law of the land? Those reactionaries never accepted Social Security. From 1935 to today, they've never accepted it. They've never accepted Medicare. They want to destroy these programs. They will not change. The only thing you can do is shut them down, put them out of business, take the lever by which they're trying to destroy the government. That lever you must break before their faces, as Lincoln said when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery was the means by which the Confederates held sway over the border states. That lever we will break before their faces. And, of course, the implied powers serve the goals that are enumerated there in the preamble, and above all, the common defense and the general welfare, which are then assigned special attention when we get to the powers of Congress. So the Constitution's not a suicide pact, and it's time to shut down these chuckleheads. Back in a minute. So we'd like to thank Mayor Vincent Gray, who has shown ability in the recent past to resist the winds. I mean, he's been out there demonstrating against Obama at different points over these issues of austerity, protesting the austerity which Obama, in a cowardly way, has been willing to entertain. So Vincent Gray essentially points out that the existing functions of government are essential. And if they're not essential, what are we doing here? You certainly don't want to give up that high ground to the reactionary chuckleheads and the fascist wacko birds. So let's just look at some of the details. Now, as of October 1st, here's what you're looking at. You will have no national parks. You will have no Small Business Administration loans getting processed. Right? You're strangling your economic recovery. There will be no ability of the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, to approve loans. There will be no passports and no visas. Now, that's a matter of commerce. Suppose you have to take a business trip. This is the real world. There will be no new people registered for Social Security or Medicare. WIC, this is where we get into immediate morbidity mortality. 9 million mothers and children depend on the Women, Infants, Children Supplemental Nutrition Program. This is childhood and maternal nutrition. If that shuts down and the flow of protein to babies is cut off, you're going to get cognitive impairment. You're going to get people who will be marred and scarred for life. Again, because of the chuckleheads and their reactionary desires, right? Fueled by the fascist interests, very much under the influence of various think tanks in Washington. So we have 800,000 federal employees will be furloughed without pay. And don't kid yourself, they won't get that money back. That's a net minus. It's like adding 800,000 to the unemployment rolls. 100 classes of school children per week visit the Smithsonian. They'll be told essentially to drop dead. Once we get beyond a week or two, Head Start, which is the breakfast and preschool for poor kids, that will be cut. And in particular, the WIC, back to WIC, this problem comes at a very sensitive time. For example, in some states, the WIC gets an appropriation every couple of weeks. And ironically, one of the moments when the appropriation is supposed to come is precisely next Tuesday. So after that, it gets worse and worse. And when will it end? It doesn't end. These people learn nothing. They have learned nothing and forgotten nothing. They are fanatics. They are incorrigible. They are simply an undigestible mass of reactionary saboteur opinion inside the body politic. So that is their approach. Now, of course, their motivation is that they hate Obamacare. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's also the case that this is a minority group. In other words, the super hardcore, the most extreme fanatic cadre of the chuckleheads and wacko birds is estimated to be in the range of 20 to 30 members of the House of Representatives. But, of course, because of their ideological blackmail capabilities, with the help of Ted Cruz, and we'll be on his case later on, those 2 or 3 dozen get themselves up to almost 100. But even so, there'd be plenty of votes to pass a continuing resolution, right? Let the Republicans lose half of their votes, the Democrats can make it up, and normal operations continue. If it weren't for Hastert the Bastard. Hastert the Bastard seems to have changed the U.S. Constitution without any due process. This character, right? He's now gone back to collecting money. He's left all kinds of poison pills, hasn't he? One of his poison pills is the Hastert rule. We've got a crisis going on in the United States Postal Service because of another time bomb planted by Hastert the Bastard that for some reason the Postal Service had to pay 10 years of future benefits every year. His goal, obviously, to bankrupt, break up, privatize, and loot the Postal Service, including the money pot inside of it. The Heritage Action Group, the Club of Growth, all of these ideologues, they are ruling the day. And it's interesting that even groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they're nowhere. This is what's most dangerous about the Republicans. Parties that deal in interests have a certain kind of rationality, no matter how sociopathic or wayward those interests might be. But when you're dealing with people that are motivated by pure ideology, pure fanaticism, then it's extremely dangerous, right? The 1930s and 40s are replete with all sorts of examples of how ugly it gets when you have governments that are ruled by ideology rather than some notion of interest, an enlightened self-interest, or even not so enlightened. So they want to blackmail this shutdown, use the shutdown to blackmail on Obamacare. They also want to try to blame Obama for this stuff. I'm sorry, it won't work. Now, Obama, well, let's forget about Obama for a minute. It doesn't revolve around him. Here's the way it seems to be going. As of Thursday to Friday, it looks like the House leadership, that is Boehner and company, his gang, they're attempting to pass some kind of temporary funding bill. In other words, essentially there were three things that could happen. The Senate is going to vote today, Friday. That's Friday, the 27th of September. The Senate will vote on a continuing resolution, and this will have problems. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Senate continuing resolution will essentially fund the government, I think, until about the middle of November, the way it's been announced. The Republicans in the House could vote for that, right? Harry Reid is going to vote for that and then leave town. The ball will go into the Republicans' court. They could vote for that. They could prolong everything until the middle of November. The other thing they could do is essentially to try to get some goodies tacked on, right? There's a Republican list of ideological demands, or the Republicans could go for something very, very short, like a week or 2 weeks or something like that. Now, what may well happen here is that the funding of the government, the so-called debt ceiling and the borrowing authority, could then merge with the question of funding the government. In other words, the funding of the government is October 1st. The debt ceiling and the borrowing authority right now estimated by Lude of the Treasury to be about the 17th of October. If these come together, we then have an opportunity, I think, to cut these characters off at the knees. Because remember, as soon as the borrowing authority comes into play, you have explicit constitutional authority. It's called the 14th Amendment. The public debt of the United States shall not be questioned, meaning must be paid. And you can't choose whether you obey that. You've got to obey it, or you are in insurrection yourself, Obama. Back in a minute. Welcome back to Radio. Let me point out right away that Boehner and his gang of fanatics, the chuckleheads and wacko birds, they have already blackmailed the Senate majority. In other words, Harry Reid, this right-wing Democrat, this sad excuse for a Democratic leader, he has already capitulated to the wacko birds, largely, on the amount of discretionary spending in this budget. Here's the way it goes. If we go back to the full fury of the sequester, including the caps that were included in the 2011 Satan Sandwich budget deal. So if we take Satan Sandwich plus sequester cliff, that would mandate domestic discretionary at $967 billion. Okay, $967 billion. We're talking about figures that get somewhat below or somewhat above $1 trillion on the domestic discretionary, right? Not the entitlements and not some other things. So $967 billion would be the lowest austerity level. Harry Reid is proposing $986.3 billion. So that's what, $20 billion more. $986.3 billion. That's already a surrender, because the demand of the House liberals, I think Steny Hoyer even, and company in the House, want at least $1058 billion. In other words, $1,058 billion. And that's almost $100 billion more. That's almost 10% more than the lowest austerity budget. And it's a good, what? It's a good $60 billion more than, or no more. It's $70 billion more than the Harry Reid number. So there is a group of Democratic liberals, Steny Hoyer and company, even though he's he's also a right winger. But on this one, he's somewhat better than Harry Reid. That's not enough. In other words, the question is, will the sequester be built into what the Democrats from the Senate send over to be voted on? And Harry Reid says, yes, we're going to respect this disgusting sequester. Therefore, we have here on The Hill, right? The Hill newspaper, Tuesday, September 24th. Reid holds the line on federal spending. Majority leader likely to keep the sequester in place. He will accept the sequester looted funding levels, right? The savagely cut killer austerity, again, creeping in. So I would say the answer to all of this is if, as may be likely, we get the government shutdown flowing together with the national bankruptcy, the default, that puts it together in a package. The Republicans seem to think that the public doesn't like shutting down the federal government, but that the public would be happy with default. Well, guess again, because that, of course, the permanent damage of the national bankruptcy and default is far greater, right? The losses of every individual will be infinitely more. So this is, of course, a lot of this is the product of the fecklessness of Obama. Obama would need to go on television right now, tonight, and say, we have the 14th Amendment. Part 4 says the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. That has to be obeyed. I'm sorry. The debt ceiling is unconstitutional. Bankruptcy is illegal. I'm maintaining U.S. obligations. Deal with it. And again, anybody trying to shut down the government should be told, first of all, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. All of these government functions are indeed essential, as Mayor Gray wisely points out. We're using, again, the laboratory of democracy in the District of Columbia. Therefore, all of that spending will be maintained. And if you don't like it, remember, we're operating under 4 to 5, at least, states of emergency. And if this is simply the way the Republicans are going to do it, you cannot lead the United States government over a cliff. That is not the purpose, right? The Constitution is not a suicide pact. It's not a recipe for how to destroy civilization in this part of the world. Now, of course, the fecklessness and cowardice of Obama would militate against this possibility, but, well, that's the way it goes. Now, what else can we say here? We're going to talk about Senator Cruz in just a minute. Let's see. Harry Reid has caved. Steny Hoyer may still be fighting. I don't know. The Hastert rule must go. And again, the U.S. Postal Service, that's a real emergency. That's another thing where, since the Constitution mandates a postal service, you could intervene in saying, I'm sorry, constitutional authority is that I must maintain these postal deliveries. And there's no way around that. So, again, what is likely to happen today, Friday, the 27th, is that a bill will come up in the Senate. The House bill from last Thursday will come up. Harry Reid will strip out the language which defunds Obamacare. That will then be passed with Democratic votes almost exclusively, maybe a couple of Republicans, who knows. That will then be sent to the House. The Democratic Senate will then leave town, and the House will be sitting there with that what to do. And they'll be hearing from Dement at the Heritage Foundation, bankrupt the government, shut it down. The Club of Growths will be saying the same thing. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a whole series of concrete moneyed business interests will be saying, no, you're going to wreck our rackets. And the Wall Street class, as soon as you get this issue of the default, the national bankruptcy, the default on Treasury bills, bonds, and notes, then Wall Street will be screaming at the Republicans. So, again, it is an exercise in fanaticism. What we need to do, remember, we're the United Front Against Austerity. We've got to maintain a mobilization, no killer cuts, no genocidal austerity, and that's directed also against Harry Reid. Harry Reid, your number is way too low. We don't want 967 billion. We don't want Harry Reid's number of 986.3 billion. We even think 10.1058 billion is way too low. We're interested in the tax reform called the Wall Street sales tax, which will increase those numbers by funding the government. Now, in the meantime, don't look now, but one of the proposals from the Republicans is there should be immediate emergency tax reform. Whoa! And this Dave Camp, a chucklehead, is working on this silently, right? These publications that we have, right? The Hill, Politico, Roll Call, they're noting that Dave Camp at the House Ways and Means Committee has gone silent. What is he doing? He's preparing tax cuts for the rich. You got it. Tax cuts for the rich. And that's going to be brought out. Now we'll go through what the Republicans are demanding. These are the sweeteners. These are the riders that the House bill that Boehner is likely to add to the debt ceiling in particular. It would be defund Obamacare, no Affordable Care Act for 1 year. The Republicans would include new tax cuts for the rich from the fanatic camp. They would implement the Keystone Pipeline. I would actually be inclined to let them have that as a face-saving concession. They want to overhaul deregulation. Now, here we have to distinguish. We know that Mike Lee thinks that child labor laws are unconstitutional. He goes to the loony bin, but there are, of course, regulations that can be dispensed with. More oil drilling? Well, case by case. No regulation of carbon by the Environmental Protection Administration. We might have room to compromise there. No Dodd-Frank. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. I'm wondering if we have our guests lined up. I wonder if the control room can let me know. I guess we don't. Okay, so anyway, let me just recite once again the ideological Christmas tree list that Boehner has. No Obamacare for 1 year. Tax cuts for the rich. I think they want to cut the top rate to 25% on income. They want the Keystone Pipeline. Again, some of these are within the realm of reality. Regulatory overhaul. Got to watch out for that. Some yes, some no. Oil drilling. They want drill, baby, drill. You got to be more judicious. But again, there's room for some give. And then the Environmental Protection Agency on carbon, we can shut that down. And then Dodd-Frank, because Dodd-Frank is it's feckless, but it has some things. They want to essentially wipe out the Consumer Financial Protection Agency. No, we want to make that stronger. And there's also some idea that they're going to put in bans on abortion. So there's going to be a whole series of ideological riders. But now let's turn away from the mess in Washington and go back to the sidewalks of New York, where we know that we have the fight going on, the Tax Wall Street Party and its candidate, Randy Credico, fighting against the bankrupt candidacy of the Soros clone, de Blasio. And also we saw Lahota, or whatever his name is. We saw him on cable TV this week. So let's get a report from Daniela Walls. Daniela,
hi, Webster.
Welcome.
Webster?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Well, first, congratulations on the viral movement to draft you as the new Federal Reserve Chairman. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
First, you'd be the best since Mariner Eccles, Webster, but better. Webster, you there?
Thank you very much. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Okay. Well, we have the start of our new website, thanks to the great web designer Kyle Romberg at N Communications. And we'll be continuously adding content over the next weeks and building it. But everybody can check out the beginning of it now at taxwallstreetparty.org.
Taxwallstreetparty.org. Sounds good. Hello. Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Anyway, the Tax Wall Street Party, yes, indeed. And remember, this is designed to be imitated, right? Wherever you are, why don't you study the possibility of being the Tax Wall Street Party candidate? You can take that into the Democratic primary. God knows you can take it into the Republican primary. You can take it into the Green Party primary or the Libertarians or the Constitutionalists. Anybody and everybody can be challenged on that.
I lost you. I'm sorry.
Okay, continue then, Daniela. The Tax Wall Street Party website is up.
You can check out the Tax Wall Street Party website at taxwallstreetparty.org. And if you'd like to donate, there's a donate button on that site. And then we just printed 10,000 new flyers with Randy's campaign program on them to pass out to New Yorkers. We need volunteers to come pick up flyers from us and pass them out, or join one of the flyering teams that we're putting together. So if you want to help us pass out flyers, call Chris, who is Chris Reese, who is the on-ground organizer, at 908-433-3266. I'll be sending out an email today about literature distribution to people who signed up to volunteer on the website. Donations are still much needed, as always. Like I said, you can donate to Randy's campaign at creditcode2013.org. There's a donate button on the homepage. And if you can volunteer, please email me at taxwallstreetparty@gmail.com. We also have 5 new YouTube campaign ads, and I'm uploading them today to Randy's website under a button called New Campaign Ads. So watch them. They're funny parodies of this election. You can check them out on the website and share them.
Great.
This week, Webster, the New York Times broke an article designed to look like a hit piece at de Blasio Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, so the phones are that in Nicaragua in the 80s. And so what this really did for many New Yorkers this week is to make him look better. It was reinforcement. It was left cover Webster. His progressive credentials have been coming into question lately, and he needed some bona fides. And the fact that he went to Nicaragua in the 80s to help the Sandinistas, for many people that might have had doubts based on what he said on election night when he started to sound like a law and order candidate, right. Now this solidifies his progressive image for them. Remember that during Obama's first campaigns, they made him look like he was coming from the radical left too, and he ended up governing center-right.
Exactly. It's called the art of saying something good about a candidate while pretending to say something bad. It's a limited hangout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, instead of looking at Obama's image or rhetoric, they should have looked at the fact that Wall Street was funding him, and they're funding both these guys. And de Blasio is following the Obama playbook. You campaign as a progressive, like you said, and then you govern center-right. But his campaign is eerily parallel to Obama's because he has the exact same campaign team. It's the same operation, Webster. De Blasio is a guy that's been public advocate for not even a full term yet, kind of like Obama getting elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004 and then already running for president in 2007. De Blasio just became public advocate, and the next thing you know, he's running for mayor with the same group of people behind him. And I'm not sure how de Blasio is going to play the Sandinista connection yet, whether he'll distance himself or embrace it, but either way, he should hold this as a matter of pride, because if he supported the Sandinista government, he was on the right side of the issue. For Randy, it is one of his biggest sources of pride. He stood up, for the democratically elected Sandinistas and helped the most indigent people in Nicaragua while the Reagan administration was trying to secretly overthrow them, similar to the Obama administration now trying to overthrow Assad by funding the rebels. I know it's a mayoral campaign, mayoral race in New York, but Randy is the peace candidate. If anybody should benefit from the Iran-Contra thing coming into play or becoming an issue now, or stop and frisk, it should be Randy. Randy's involvement in Nicaragua is much deeper and longer than de Blasio's. When de Blasio traveled to Nicaragua, he was with the Quixote Center in Maryland, and the Quixote Center the Quixote Center is spelled like Don Quixote. De Blasio's working for the Quixote Center is curiously similar to Obama. This is what you were talking about before, working for these non-profit community groups that are really funded by big corporate foundations on the left.
Right.
Whereas Randy went down there, Webster, as an individual. This is the difference. Randy went to Nicaragua, as a political satirist and comedian on his own, and toured Nicaragua raising money for the displaced children, in that war-torn country without any big foundation backing him, which makes it much more radical. Later in 1990, Randy was still there holding fundraisers for the Sandinista Party when Daniel Ortega was running for re-election. And the Sandinista government was the revolution. They overthrew Somoza. Randy is still considered a national hero in Nicaragua and travels there a few times a year. So if anybody's going to get credit or blame for Nicaragua, that attention should go to Randy. Randy has the real record here.
Daniela, do we have some radio spots on Spanish language radio pointing these things out?
Yes, we do. Yes, we've got. We took your advice and got some. We could only afford late night spots, but we have some late night spots on Spanish radio, and we're gonna point this out.
Tremendous.
That Randy was that De Blasio was there for 10 days in the 80s, and Randy made during that period 25 trips to Nicaragua, Webster. And he is still revered in Nicaragua. De Blasio could go to Nicaragua now, and nobody would know who the hell he was. So that's the situation. So it's two different. It's coming from two different places. One's coming from a big corporate-funded foundation, and the other is an individual who went down there with conviction. Do you want to hear a little about Joe LaHoda? Do we have some time?
Yes, but quickly.
Okay, sorry. Well, the Republican, Joe LaHoda, is having a tough time.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, no. Okay, LaHoda next week. LaHoda next week again.
Okay, so we're going to get the lowdown on the Republican candidate LaHoda in our next report from the ground. Thank you very much, Daniela. And remember, that's PaxWallStreetParty.org, and you can contribute there on the website, correct? We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is our second hour here on the 27th of September. Again, we're coming off a very successful C-SPAN taping of my lecture at the National Press Club Tuesday, the 24th of September, on the Russian fleets. One of the things we found is that the proclamation of the Thanksgiving holiday, that was, I believe, October 2nd, 1863. Lincoln and Seward put out a proclamation of Thanksgiving. What's to give thanks for? Gettysburg and Vicksburg, sure. That's in the beginning of July. Then come the awful draft riots in New York with lynchings and mayhem. You've seen it in the gangs of New York. And then the horrible rout at Chickamauga, the second bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. But then right after that, on the 2nd of October, we get the proclamation of Thanksgiving. What's to give thanks for? Well, again, if you read in the proclamation, as I do in this lecture, you'll see that one of the things you're giving thanks for is that even though you've had a civil war, which seems to some foreign countries to be an engraved invitation to intervene, that has not happened. And it comes in the immediate wake of the arrival of the Russian fleets. So can we have a situation where Thanksgiving has a Russian inspiration? We certainly have a situation where the career of Grant and indeed the career of George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga and the Sledgehammer of Nashville, right? The only guy who actually destroyed a Confederate army on the battlefield at Nashville at the end, their careers were helped by Russian officers like Desarnaud, A-R-N-A-U-D, and Turchin, T-U-R-C-H-I-N. There's the Turchin Reservation still perched up on Missionary Ridge above Chattanooga. Now, just to sum up now our first hour, when it comes to the debt ceiling and the borrowing authority, the 14th Amendment rules the roost. This is clear-cut. Obama's lawyers are crazy. They better go back to the drawing board. What part, dear lawyers, do you not understand of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned? It means you've got to pay it. and you can't choose that. You are compelled to obey that constitutional provision. It's not a delicatessen. It's a series of peremptory orders when you're a federal official. So that's clear. You've got to order the Secretary of the Treasury to hold auctions, raise money, and pay the bills. And the second part is, as Mayor Vincent Gray of the District of Columbia wisely shows us, declare the entire federal government essential and fund it at existing levels. And again, you have another supplementary argument on that because you're operating under multiple states of emergency. And you have to hope, as Lincoln did, right? Sometimes Lincoln would have to push ahead. Franklin D. Roosevelt, too, sometimes. Push ahead and hope that the Congress will validate what you've done after the fact. And usually, presidential leadership will carry the day over that squawking gaggle of chuckleheads and wacko birds, fanatics, extremists, anarchists, and whatever we have over there. And let me also point out, it was brought up very kindly by Daniela in the last segment, you look at that Congress, how are you ever going to get a recovery through that gaggle? Here's a way to do it. It's the Federal Reserve Act, right? It's a piece of lawlessness, to be sure. In theory and in practice, we condemn it. But right now, it's a little bit like those states of emergency. Federal Reserve Act is on the books. You put a Fed governor in there, somebody like me, and they can open up credit facilities. Helicopter Ben Bernanke made $27 trillion available to zombie banks in 08, 09, and after. There are credit facilities that are still going in there. Maiden Lane for AIG. You can create a credit facility for anything the Federal Reserve leadership decides is required. So we're talking about opening up a Main Street credit facility. It's an infrastructure facility. You put out a tender offer. You say, we're going to buy, and this is what they did with these other credit facilities. We're willing to buy the bonds of states and localities and authorities if there's 0% 100-year bonds, and if they are exclusively dedicated to building infrastructure, be it roads, railroads, water projects, ports, electricity grids, public buildings, schools, hospitals, housing, and other essential activities. And with that, you go around the Congress. The Congress has no say because the Congress has already delegated that power, illegally, I would say, but might as well use it, to the Federal Reserve. In other words, the goal is to get a recovery and to avoid the breakdown of the entire government. Because the opposite side of this argument is if you don't get a recovery, you're going to see the collapse of this form of government. Sure as shooting. So there it is. Now choose and therefore act. Obama can take inspiration from the courage of Mayor Gray, right? Mayor Gray is being told, hey, they're going to throw you in jail. Well, he's saying, let them come and do it. No jury will convict of that. And if those wacko birds impeach Obama in the House, let it go to the Senate and we'll see what's happening. You can even see that with the existing civil war between reactionaries and fascists in the Republican Party. Those seem to be the two factions. Now, let's do a quick review, though, of international policy. First of all, on Syria, we now have a United Nations Security Council resolution draft about how Syria will divest itself of its existing chemical weapons arsenal. Important victories for Russia and China, defeats for Mad Dog Kerry, Mad Dog Samantha Power, and Mad Dog Susan Rice are that there's no mention of Chapter 7. There's no invocation of Chapter 7 in that. So there's no possibility of using this for military action. And there's no blame. The resolution does not say that the Assad government carried out the attack. So we've got Kerry, Rice, and Samantha Power eating crow big time. Putin and Lavrov have bested them. Russia says, and this question of the blame, right? The reason I think that this has been possible is thanks to the people of goodwill across the world. I've tried to do my part, certainly, but others have more bandwidth, let's say, to expose the fact that there is no proof that the Syrian government did the chemical attacks, right? Kerry has kept saying, we have proof, we have proof. Russia says they've never seen the proof. So Security Council members, foreign governments, the Congress supposedly got the proof. Where's the proof? The people want to see the proof. And Russia says they've never seen it either. So Russia says this is homemade sarin. And we have to take account of the tremendous contributions of Sister Agnès Mariam de la Croix, Melkite Christian of the Monastery of St. James in Qara, Q-A-R-A, between Homs and Damascus in Syria. The Russians, therefore, very skeptical. They say this was a provocation by the rebels to get international aid. And the new president, Rouhani of Iran, on Charlie Rose, also pointed out his skepticism. And Charlie Rose looks worse from week to week. Might be a good time for him to give up on alcohol. That might be a big step in the right direction for Charlie. The terrorist rebels are in total disarray. For a long time, the Western governments had attempted to maintain the illusion of a free Syrian army with a supreme military council led by the CIA golden boy, General Idris, and there was a Syrian national coalition led by this character Jarba, the most recent puppet leader there. We're now told that the people, essentially many of the brigades, virtually all of them, have dumped the Free Syrian Army. They've dumped the Syrian National Coalition and Jarba, and they've gone over to al-Nusra. They've gone over to al-Qaeda. So you're seeing a monolithic al-Qaeda opposition, or better yet, a normal al-Qaeda Nusra and an extreme Islamic Emirate, extreme al-Qaeda. Choose those. No, don't. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, the new UN resolution apparently going to be voted on tonight, Friday, September 27th. No Chapter 7, no threat of military action against Syria, no blame. Russia and Putin, Lavrov have carried the day. Kerry, Rice, Samantha, eat crow. The big agitation in the world is to show that the rebels used the poison gas and that the rebels brought in victims, kidnapped children from the Latakia region, this in particular, the thesis of Sister Agnès Mariam, who's been giving all kinds of interviews from, I believe, Geneva. The terrorist rebels are in disarray. They have dumped the Syrian National Coalition of Jarba, funded by the Saudis and the French. The Free Syrian Army and its Supreme Military Council under Idris have gone nowhere. Most of them have joined Nusra, but Nusra is facing a challenge from even more fanatical savages, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham. In the meantime, also, other problems for this brainwash machine. Brown Moses is exposed as a faker. Remember Gay Girl in Damascus? Turned out to be an American academic writing from Ireland. Brown Moses turns out to be an unemployed financial services worker by the name of Ed Higgins, apparently operating from Leicester, England. That's Brown Moses. Now, mixed in with this is, of course, Iran. New president of Iran, interested in alleviating the economic warfare against this country, perfectly legit. Iran wants nuclear talks in Geneva soon, in October. And at the margin of the UN General Assembly in New York, we've had the highest diplomatic contact between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran in 44 years. The foreign ministers, that is to say, Skull and Bones Kerry, representing the United States, if I can say that, meeting with the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, I think, and that's moving along. Now, just this much freaks out Netanyahu. Netanyahu screaming that this is all a fraud. The U.S. should stop talking, don't negotiate. It's all a trap. Notice, it is the U.S. taxpayers who subsidize these tantrums from Netanyahu, right? If it weren't for all of that aid, he'd be forced to find a modus vivendi, a practical compromise. And it's unfortunately this blind support that gives him the subsidy that he needs to go ahead and do these things. And this is, again, even by Israeli standards, a very, very far right-wing government. We also, retrospectively, right, Iran made a general offer to the United States, a modus vivendi, a way of coexisting in 2003. Iran was helping the U.S. against the Taliban in Afghanistan. The U.S. gave nothing in return, cut it off. And even under Ahmadinejad, who gets bad press, I think, undeservedly to some degree, in 2010, Iran made an offer to limit the percentages of the enrichment. And according to Flint Leverett, this was spurned by the Obama administration. The U.S. could not take yes for an answer. So all of that going on, the weakening of the U.S. position, the moving towards some kind of U.S.-Russian condominium, all of this, I think, on the whole, positive, because the goal is war avoidance, not the maintenance of any lunatic notion of exceptionalism. And again, exceptionalism is available, but it's got to be earned every day with positive contributions to human progress, not bluster and certainly not war. Now, back to the domestic front, which today is going to be the dominant one for the first time in several weeks. Obamacare. Obamacare is a flawed compromise, sure. At the beginning, I was for Medicare for all, single payer. That didn't work out. Now, the process of this vale of tears that we're in, right, in our time, this is what you could get, given all of the human failings of all of the different groups. Here's Obamacare. What are you going to do with it? Junk it completely and go back to zero? No, that's ridiculous. That's radically ahistorical. You go into it, you enter it, you reform it, you fight to make it look more and more and more like a Medicare for all. It's like the Articles of Confederation. They're unworkable, but you go into them, and eventually it grows together into a federal system, something like that. The main hysteria of the Republicans was articulated by Cruz, the hypocrite. But in this case, he said, once the subsidies have been established, once people taste the sweetness of that sugar candy, they will want that permanently. It will be impossible to repeal. In other words, what the Republicans fear is a recognition of what Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed already in January 1944. Among other rights, there is a right to health care. Sorry, Ron Paul. Sorry, Rand Paul. Sorry, libertarians. There is a right to health care. Not to go and beg for charity, but a right. Americans have the right. And this is not just individual. Take your axiomatic standpoint, no longer as the individual and the individual psychology, but the needs of the entire national economy and the entire workforce. What do we need? We need a workforce which is more and more educated, more and more trained. Therefore, they've got to live longer and longer because we've got to be able to invest more and more years of education and travel and other kinds of capital inputs into people. But you can't then have them die the moment they get their PhD. They've got to have a working life that allows the investment to be realized. And therefore, we've got to have national health care. Now, concerning how to do it, well, that will play itself out. Notice that a lot of what we're seeing now is the sabotage of Obamacare by predatory bosses, company bosses, bankers, and others, under the cover of Obamacare. Obamacare, given the hysteria of the Republican ad campaign, basically says if you're the boss of a company, you can do whatever you want. Blame it on Obamacare. You can do that now. You may not be able to do it in the future, but right now, why not tell employers? Say, hey, employers, if there are lots of them, and I'm not sure there are, who are making full-time workers into part-time workers. Tell employers, look, don't you dare make 40-hour-a-week full-time workers into part-time workers, because in the future you're going to face scrutiny and retribution, boys. Now, it would take a president with somewhat more gumption than Obama to do this, but, and remember, if you want to get that recovery, Tarpley for Fedhead. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington. Follow everything at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net. You want to find my books? They're all at Tarpley.net. And now, as of this week, we've got the Twitter feed. The Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed is also visible on Tarpley.net, so you can get the hot off the presses, most recent updates. I noticed that some of the libertarians are saying that Obamacare is bad for blue-collar workers. Well, 17 states have published their prices. Take a look at them. You can find them. It's at that Kaiser Family Foundation healthcare website. And look at the exchanges. As of Tuesday, you can go on the exchange. It's a marketplace. It's a portal. It's like Kayak or Travelocity or something like this. It shows you the different possibilities. There's catastrophic bronze, there's silver, gold, platinum, and so forth. You got to calculate the differentials, the kinds of co-pays, co-insurance, out of pocket, and all this other stuff. But eventually, it's probably going to be better than being totally nude in the face of uncertain fortune, right? Even if you're young, and motorcycle crash, and overdose, God knows what, snowboarding, skiing, it's something that you need to have, because otherwise you can bankrupt yourself, your parents, you can reduce everybody to penury. So you want to have this. It's responsible. And again, the fact that people can go to hospitals and expect to be treated at emergency rooms, which is, of course, essential, which we must have. The idea that you would, make some payment in lieu of that, I think, probably not totally unreasonable. Although, again, we want Medicare for all, single-payer system. Get the private profit motive out of there. And we're some of the libertarians are trying to bring back the glories, the joys of the charity ward. The charity ward. Well, this takes us back to the world of Dickensian cruelty of the 19th century. The charity ward is no answer. That was the 19th century. We now have the 21st century, right? The charity ward is back there with the workhouse and the treadmill and Mr. Bumble and so forth. Americans have economic rights. This was in the 1944 bill. We won them on the battlefield, defeating fascism. Ever hear of fascism? In World War II, we were robbed by the assassination of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But now if we want to have a competitive labor force for the 21st century, we must have national health care. This cannot be left to people hit or miss. It's not a commodity where if you don't have the money, you don't get it. And it is not something that you get by charity. It again, it is your right. If you don't like the inherent rationing mechanisms of the government, remember that the private insurance companies use the rationing methods of the so-called market. They say, you don't have the money, you can't pay for it, you die. I'd take my chances with a government board. I can organize a demonstration. I can go and lean on Congress people. I can do all sorts of things, right? Think about it. Be political. Don't be a Robinson Crusoe lone wolf out there. And in the middle of this, we have Ted Cruz. I'm shocked and horrified to see the libertarians swoon for this hypocrite. Ted Cruz has now entered the divine pantheon of so many dupes. Ted Cruz, along with Rand Paul, Ron Paul, and a few others, these are now the reigning deities of the libertarian pagan temple, because believe me, it is pagan. It is worship of mammonism in the worst form. We saw Ted Cruz for 21 hours, and for some of us, that's enough for the rest of our lives. But Cruz, of course, means the cross. Some people make puns on cruise control, how he's out of cruise control, and so forth. What I find most remarkable about him is the facies hypocrita, the face of hypocrisy, that expression of pained earnestness, humility, and concern. He's penitent. He is a sleek, soft, oily hypocrite. He is an unctuous pretender. Dante, when he has to go from the seventh circle down to the eighth circle of fraud, rides on the back of Geryon, a legendary mythological monster who nevertheless has the sallow, hypocritical face of the self-righteous man. It's an affectation, the affectation of selfless concern. In world literature, we have Seth Pecksniff, the fake architect of Martin Chuzzlewit by Dickens. Take a look at it. Mr. Pecksniff, great figure of the hypocrite. He's supposed to be an architect. He's never built anything. He's got a school of architecture which he uses to steal the fortunes of unfortunate students. They get really no training, and Mr. Pecksniff pretends to be sacrificing himself when in reality he's raking in the money. I think you find in Bronte, you'll find a similar hypocrite, right, who essentially gets tuition money from the parents, keeps the girls in the school on absolutely minimal food and heating and clothing rations, and lives then in luxury himself. Elmer Gantry, the religious faker, getting kind of close here, right? Elmer Gantry by Sinclair Lewis pretends to be a holy man, in reality obsessed with power, women, money, and God knows what else. I think, though, probably the world champion in terms of world literature, it's Molière's Tartuffe. Tartuffe, Tartuffe, the imposter, who is someone who pretends to be a holy man, but in reality is attempting to parasitize the family fortune of a rich bourgeois living in Paris. And the French, of course, is extremely good because it's all written in these rhyming alexandrins, right? Il est de faux dévots ainsi que de faux braves. He says there are fake holy men as well as people who pretend to be brave. Don't follow the people who make the most noise. Don't follow the people who make faces. Ne sont pas ceux aussi qui font tant de grimaces. Don't follow the ones who are making faces to show how holy they are. How about this one? Et quoi? Vous ne ferez nulle distinction entre l'hypocrisie et la dévotion. Won't you make any distinction between hypocrisy and real devotion, right? Do you think that artifice means sincerity? Do you think that appearance means truth? Do you think that the fakery is the same as a real person? Do you think that counterfeit is the same as real money? And so forth, right? These are some of the people who are trying to warn this rich bourgeois, because eventually Tartuffe gets him to give him all of his money, and he tries to kick the dupe out of his own house. So watch out for people who are charlatans. They are attempting to make their own fortune on the way to heaven, and their hypocrisy is completely self-interested. Remember, this is the holier than thou, right? Cruz is holier than thou. This is the takfiri. The takfiri in Islam are the holier than thous. They say, I'm a real Muslim, you're not. In the case of Cruz, I don't know what he says about religion, but he says, I'm a real Republican, you're not. If you're not willing to destroy the government over Obamacare, you're as bad as Hitler and the Nazis. Oh, my God. That's Cruz. He's widely hated. He's going down. We'll see you in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just from the English translation of Molière here, we're reading one of Tartuffe's enemies as Tartuffe tries to take over the entire property of this duped bourgeois. Here's what we find. Nothing more noble or more beautiful than is the holy zeal of true devoutness. Just so, I think there's naught more odious than whited sepulchres of outward unction, these barefaced charlatans, these hireling zealots, whose sacrilegious, treacherous pretense deceives at will, and with impunity makes mockery of all that men hold sacred, men who, enslaved to selfish interests, make trade and merchandise of godliness, and try to purchase influence and office with false eye-rolling and affected raptures. Those men, I say, who with uncommon zeal seek their own fortunes on the road to heaven, who skilled in prayer have always much to ask, and live at court to preach retirement, who reconcile religion with their vices. And it just goes on. Take a look at Le Tartuffe by Molière, and don't become that dupe, that Autran, or whatever his name is, who gets his house taken away. You let Tartuffe into your house, he's going to try to take it over and evict you out onto the sidewalk. And everybody knows that this is self-promotion, right? Senator Corker says, y'all are using this for a fundraising stunt. The House Republicans hate him because he's pushed them into the edge of the cliff. The people in the Senate hate him because of just his abrasive personality. But the larger problem, right, the reactionary Republicans, we got Ralph Hutchins, the Georgia State Insurance Commissioner, says that his goal is maximum obstruction of Obamacare. Too bad if you die, huh? Too bad if you could get coverage as of January 1st. And I say to people, don't die. Sign up next week. Fight for your rights. Fight to get treated. Have demonstrations. If they try to say no, then get out there and fight. So, couple of things now. Let's try to do some hopscotching the world for headlines. First of all, on the Washington Navy Yard, so many red flags, so many red flags. The police, the contractor, the vetting agency, all of them failed. What's the answer? He was a controlled patsy. There was a national security override on all these things that said it doesn't matter what he does, he goes through, because there was a desire to issue a warning to Obama and to intimidate the people in the Pentagon, saying, look, Dempsey and others, right, we can come after you. We can make you look really bad. We can fix your wagon. The Italian government, Berlusconi, who has been the target of a multi-year vendetta by judges, some of them of Maoist background, Berlusconi is going to be ousted most likely from the Italian Senate. He's going to be kicked out because he's been finally convicted on some kind of tax fraud. His party alleges that this is a dirty operation, and the Berlusconi party is threatening mass resignations of its members of parliament, and they're joined by the Northern League, the Lombard League or Northern League, are going to join in. And it's very interesting. President Napolitano, now a Wall Street operative, in the past a pseudo-communist, said this is not a coup d'etat. In other words, jailing Berlusconi, or at least kicking him out of the Senate, not a coup d'etat, not a subversive operation. And the Berlusconi people shoot back. That's exactly what it is. And one firebrand lady from the Berlusconi party says, look, Napolitano, you're interfering with the actions of a political party. You're a partisan. You're not really president of the republic. You're coming down in here and you're trying to fight. Concerning the global warming issue, right, the International Panel on Climate Change, what we see in the reports today, I think, is covering up. They say, oh, we're now absolutely sure with high confidence. Where have we heard that high confidence? We got high confidence that the global temperature changes and the carbon issue are all anthropogenic. They're all done by humans. But, of course, wait a minute. It turns out that since, and this is in the fine print, I guess, of this report, since 1998, there is more carbon, but the temperature is flat. So, as one report had it, another inconvenient truth on the way to the apocalypse. In other words, these same partisans, right, whose emails were exposed last time around, are now stuck with this problem that for the past 15 years, there has been no temperature increase of the Earth's atmosphere. What are you going to do? Some people now recommend, I think the rational course, build flood barriers, right? Get ready for another Katrina, get ready for another Sandy, raise those roads on the coast of Louisiana so they're not threatened by inundation. And remember now, the bottom line, the Federal Reserve, the gridlock is overwhelming and it will only get worse. Something must be done. The only way to do this is to use the existing powers of the Federal Reserve to open credit facilities. I would recommend $5 trillion to start with. It would take the form of a tender offer. It would an offer to buy, exactly like these other credit facilities have done, an offer to buy state bonds and other local and authority bonds, 0% coupon, 100-year maturities. These are century bonds. They must be devoted to tangible, physical infrastructure, roads, railroads, ports, water systems, electricity grids, and the full range of public buildings, schools, libraries, hospitals, public housing can be done on this. And the entire array of hard infrastructure, and indeed some soft infrastructure, can also be paid for in this way. Other than that, the Russian fleets were left with, again, urging people to take a look at C-SPAN 3 in the coming weeks. It's not clear to me. I've checked it today. Doesn't seem to be scheduled yet, but it's an overview of this problem. The fleet, Russian Baltic Fleet, arrived in New York the 24th of September. Russian Pacific Fleet arrived in San Francisco on October 12th. When the rumors in San Francisco were that a Confederate raider, the Alabama, or one of the others, was approaching Shenandoah or Sumter or Nashville, was approaching. The problem of San Francisco was that the Union had a one-ocean navy, and there was very little in the way of naval resources to defend San Francisco. So they turned to the Russian admiral, Admiral Popov, and said, "Will you defend the port?" And he said, "Yes. If the Confederates come here, I will clear for action. I will defend the port." And he had 5 or 6 ships, two or three of them at least, the equal or more of the Alabama or these other raiders. So that would have made all the difference. And he even gave the Union authorities a message saying, give this to the Confederate captain, saying, look, I'm the Russian Pacific Fleet, and my master, the Tsar, has instructed me, wherever I get friendship and solidarity, I have to defend the authorities of that place. So if you come here looking for trouble, you're going to find it. And again, I think the interesting question that's left is, how did all of this get buried? Let's start with George Kennan. This is not the George Kennan you may know, the Mr. X long telegram of the 1940s, but this is the previous George Kennan, a so-called explorer of the 1880s, who was the Samantha Power of his time. He began digging up stuff about all the horrors of Siberia. Roy, is it rough to be in Siberia? Well, of course, the British in India had just suppressed the Sepoy Rebellion, the Great Rebellion of 1857, with hundreds of thousands of dead, in the same league with the U.S. Civil War total losses. But no, that wasn't the one that he was interested in. He had to go and show how bad Siberia was. So the Kennan family, their business, Russophobia, that's a big part of it. Later on, we'll talk about Harriman and some others who, Theodore Roosevelt, who completed the process of burying this important historical fact. So we'll see you again next week on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. We had I think, a decent success this week at the National Press Club. On Tuesday evening, the commemoration of the arrival of the Russian Baltic Fleet in New York Harbor 150 years ago to the day. We were right on the anniversary. This program was taped by C-SPAN, and we're hoping that C-SPAN 3, the American History Channel, will broadcast it within the usual 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks. As far as I know, this was the only commemoration of that historical event. And if you want to go and see how it was viewed at the time, you can go back to Harper's Weekly, the principal news publication and news magazine of that era, century and a half ago, and you'll see that at least two of the two editions had that on the cover, that the cover story was the Russian fleet and the emerging Entente, or indeed alliance. And I want to, without further ado, thank a couple of benefactors who helped make this possible, because it's not free, and it does take some resources. And that would be, my thanks go out to Chris Loist and to Susan Anderson. Chris Loist and Susan Anderson, thank you for helping make this possible, along, of course, with other contributors. Now, we've got to rush in medias res. The House Republicans, fanatics, anarchists, extremists, under the preamble, in the light of these emergencies, we've got to maintain the functioning of the federal government, because otherwise you could face a permanent shutdown. These fanatics, these lunatics, when will they cease and desist? They do not cease and desist. They come back fighting even harder. Somebody was saying on the blab shows, well, why don't these Republicans realize that Obamacare has been voted on and it's the law of the land? Those reactionaries never accepted Social Security from 1935 to today. They've never accepted it. They've never accepted Medicare. They want to destroy these programs. They will not change. The only thing you can do is shut them down, put them out of business, take the lever by which they're trying to destroy the government. That lever you must break before their faces, as Lincoln said when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery was the means by which the Confederates held sway over the border states. That lever we will break before their faces. And, of course, the implied powers serve the goals that are enumerated there in the preamble, and above all, the common defense and the general welfare, which are then assigned special attention when we get to the powers of Congress. So the Constitution's not a suicide pact, and it's time to shut down these chuckleheads. Back in a minute. So we'd like to thank Mayor Vincent Gray, who has shown ability in the recent past to resist the winds. I mean, he's been out there demonstrating against Obama at different points over these issues of austerity, protesting the austerity which Obama federal government to be essential, and it will simply be funded at existing levels. In other words, a continuing resolution. The funding of all federal government activities at the current rate will be provided. And lest anybody object, they'd say, well, that's a form of emergency rule, isn't it? Isn't that ruling by decree? Well, indeed, the federal government right now is functioning under emergencies. We have several emergencies in force, many of them declared by the reactionary warmonger Republicans themselves, going back to Bush. We have the 9/11 emergency. Bush declared a state of emergency. We have the Afghanistan emergency. That's, I guess, another layer of emergency when that war started. We have the Iraq emergency. We have an emergency declared after the stock market derivative panic of 2008, the banking panic. We've got, by my count, at least 4 emergencies. Undoubtedly, we have more. I'm sure people can look this up and find the number of emergencies. Under those emergencies, it is relatively easy to find the legal authority necessary to maintain the essential functions of government. We're dealing here with inherent powers. We've got inherent powers, we've got implied powers, and we've got the enumerated powers. The enumerated powers are the least of them. And when we look at the end of the enumerated powers, we find the elastic clause, all laws necessary and proper to promote the goals that are enumerated in the Constitution, and the general goals, things like general welfare, common defense. Basically, you'd look at the preamble, and you'd say, well, under the Office of Management and Budget of the federal government, that all of those activities will continue to be performed during a lapse in appropriations. The entire calculus here is that some functions of government are labeled as essential and others as non-essential. But of course, if they're non-essential, why are they being funded? I think we're facing one of those moments of crisis. We can go back and compare it to what Lincoln faced in 1861 to 1865, the crisis of secessionism coming on the heels of nullification and interposition, all motivated by the slave power conspiracy. And then from 1939 to 1945, of course, the World War II emergency. And these have inevitably resulted in the growth of executive power. And it seems to me that we ought to look at what Mayor Gray of the district is doing. In his case, he says this money that he wants to spend belongs to the District of Columbia. Those are local tax dollars. And if Congress, because of this dysfunctional group of chuckleheads and wacko birds, fascists, reactionaries, obscurantists, wreckers, saboteurs, exponents of chaos, well, if they can't get their act together to do some funding and provide for the normal functioning of government, well, then it's probably time to override their shenanigans. And one included feature of this would be to take a leaf now from the book of Mayor Gray of the District of Columbia. You can declare the entire wacko birds, chuckleheads, I don't know, individuals who are sincerely bewildered by the modern world, I sometimes think. They are attempting to shut down the United States government. That's not the news, but they're using the debt ceiling in mid-October, but more immediately they're looking at the fact that the current spending authority of the federal government runs out at midnight Monday, September 30th at midnight. Spending authority ends Tuesday, October 1st, new fiscal year, and normally new legislation would be required. Now, I want to point to the solution even before we go further with it. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, and the so-called Deficiency Act about you can't spend money unless it's been appropriated, that's served us well for a long time. But I would like to focus on something bubbling up from those splendid laboratories of democracy, which are the states, or in this case, not even states, but the District of Columbia, which really ought to be a state and has the appurtenances of a state. It acts like a state. It's just formally not a state. Mayor Vincent C. Gray, on Wednesday, designated the entirety of the district government as essential to the protection of public safety, health, and property. And this means, as he told the